Hi, right, I'm Ed Nolan, and we're just doing a short video today looking at the Milgram study. So I'm going to run through a PowerPoint now, and I will also, as well as sticking the film on Google Classroom, put the PowerPoint. So hopefully from today you'll get an overview of what Milgram did and some of the issues with his research, and then you can look at the exam questions later. Okay, so as you can see, one of the participants here buzzing on the video. One thing you need to be fully aware of is that on the internet, on YouTube, there's lots of video footage of the Milgram studies and photographs. These were generally taken not on the original study, the original with the 40 participants. These were subsequent studies that he did this, though he did do some filming on that very first study. Right, okay, let's have a look. So I've split this up into different sections, and I've put 5 points in each section, sometimes kind of squeezing them in. So let's have a look at the methodology of Milgram. So when we talk about methods, we're talking about what, not the procedures, but the kind of general approach of what he's done. So first of all, where did Milgram come from? Milgram was a Jew who grew up in New York. He went to the same school as someone called Zimbardo, was in the same year, Philip Zimbardo. And I don't know if you're aware, but after the Second World War, the Holocaust really wasn't spoken about much. It was until the 1960s that it became much more of a world focus. And so this research carried out in the 1960s, and Milgram just wanted to understand why, or the mechanism, psychological mechanism behind those Germans and others who carried out the atrocities in the Holocaust, and about them being obedient. Okay, so that's where he's looking at. You're not really going to be asked about his aims or where he was coming from, but the aim was to test if Germans were different. That was what he was looking at. His initial study was actually going to be carried out in the USA and then Germany, but when he got his results from his original study, he didn't go to his other group. The Americans were meant to have been the control group, but he found out quite quickly that maybe Americans could be highly destructive when told to do something. So it was carried out, the methodology was carried out in a laboratory environment. So the setting or the location of research was a laboratory. Now, although Milgram called it an experiment, it didn't have a change in an independent variable. He did not compare one condition to another condition in his original studies. So it can't actually be seen as an experiment. So often it's called a controlled laboratory study. Some would even call it a controlled observation, because he observed the behaviors of what was going on. But it was a controlled study. So when we look at the participants, we know Milgram used 40 males between the ages of 20 and 40. As I say, in some of the pictures, you'll see older men there. And maybe it's because they looked older in the US in the 1960s. It could also be that they were taken on subsequent studies. So these men were all from the New Haven area, which is surrounding Yale University. So it's an urban area on the east coast of the United States. And so they were all very similar kind of, well, I suppose at the time America was very broad in its cultural view, kind of makeup. But these people were a very similar view, very similar kind of person. Obviously, we're thinking about the validity and how evaluating his sampling technique. It was a self-selected sample technique. So obviously all the evaluation points have come to that. So obviously it was easy to find these participants. You knew that they wanted to be involved in that, but obviously a certain type of person would have volunteered for that. They were offered $4.50 to be part of that. So at that time, that was significant, not a significant amount of money, but it was enough to engage people in the task. It was $4 for the study and 50 cents for travel. The study was looking at, it was advertised for a study on memory and punishment. Remember that, it's memory and punishment we were looking at. Okay. Now, his participants came from a range of occupational backgrounds and education. So some of them hadn't actually graduated from high school. Some had degrees and were engineers. So they were very much a range of individuals. So that is something to say, okay, they were all males. I presume they were all white males from the New Haven area, but they were a broad spread of those of people in that area. Okay, so methodology. We talked about what method he used and his sampling and participants. Let's have a look at what he actually did in the procedures. Okay, so it was carried out at Yale University, which is a prestigious university in the United States, very prestigious. It's very similar to Oxford or Cambridge is here. There were 3 people involved in the study. The teacher, who was the actual participant. So if you have a look at the diagram on the top right hand side there, that you've got the teacher there who stood in front of this machine where he had to press buttons. You saw a picture of the machine at the beginning, the electric shock generator. Okay, the learner, who the teacher, who was the naive participant, thought was another participant, but the learner, who was Mr. Wallace, was an actor. He was what's called a Confederate. He was a part of the study, and he was to sit in a different room. And then the experimenter, who was not Milgram, but somebody who worked with Milgram, who was to conduct the study and tell the teacher what to do. Okay, so the teacher was then to present material to the learner. The learner was then to press buttons to identify their answers. And the teacher then was to administer an electric shock if they got the answers incorrect. The experimenter was there just to ensure the teacher knew what they were doing, but obviously he was there for more. Okay, so they had this word pair list. That's the task that they had to do. And it's good to remember that. The machine is called the electric shock generator. The electric shock generator, it had buttons that went up in 15 volts. And you'll see right at the end a picture of Milgram with that. And so the teacher was to administer 15 volts for the first time they got something wrong, and then 30 volts, and then 45 volts, and they were to go up. They went up in 15 volt increments. Can you see? So it gets higher each time. Okay, so they started at 15 and ended up at 450 volts. So one of your tasks is to work out, if they went up in 15s, how many buttons were there? Okay. By the way, I think it's 30, you might find. There were at 300 volts. So every time the learner got something wrong, they were to electrocute them. They didn't get everything wrong. They got some right. But every time they got something wrong, they were to administer the button. So if you can imagine, going up those buttons would have taken quite a bit of time. At 300 volts, Mr. Wallace, the learner, just stopped. He didn't say anything more. Now, in the videos, you'll hear him banging and saying, "Get out of here." And he did tell the researcher that he had a heart problem prior to this. The participants, who the teacher was, were told that the electric shocks would not cause any harm. So Mr. Wallace, in the original study, just stopped replying. In subsequent studies, that's when he started banging on the walls and saying, "Get me out of here," and all kinds of things like that. Okay. Right. Now, if the teacher then was to stop administering the shocks, the experimenter then had 4 different verbal prods they were to use, and he was to use them in order. And this was to try and standardize, to keep things reliable. So the prods were, "Please continue," and then if they still wouldn't, it'd say, "The experiment requires you to continue," and then "It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no choice. You must continue." So those were the verbal prods. As you can see, they're quite directed. Okay. Now, what Milgram measured was how many people administered the shocks after 300 volts. After Mr. Wallace had stopped responding, how many would continue on administering the shocks? Right. That was the procedures. Now, the findings and conclusions you're not going to be asked about, but they are good to know, just to know, but also in relation to evaluating things later on. So in the exam questions, you are just to talk about the kind of methodologies and procedures that Milgram used. So first of all, Yale psychology students and some postgraduate students were asked, and they said, how many do you think would go up to 450 volts? They said 0 to 3%. Okay. The reality was that 65% of the participants, so that would be, how many would that be? 26 of the participants went to the 450 volts. So 12, if you look at the diagram above here on the pie chart, you can see what happened. 65% went to 450 volts. Each person is 2.5%. So as you can see, 5 people pulled out at 300 volts, 2 at 315, sorry, 4 at 315, 2 at 330, and then it was subsequently for the next lot, with 1 person dropped out. So 450 volts, 65% went to, well beyond what they were expecting. And so this was an argument that Milgram had for his ethics. Milgram observed that as well as the quantitative data that he had collected, which was the numbers, the qualitative data that he collected was his observation. And there was clear signs of distress, sweating, trembling, biting lips. 3 of the participants had seizures, of which were so severe for 2 that they had to stop the study. So this was qualitative data. I suppose at this point you can say that he collected primary data as well rather than secondary data. He wanted to be the person in control of collecting the data. And all of the evaluation points that go with primary data, but he did have quantitative and qualitative. The follow-up questionnaire a year later, so 1 year later, he sent a questionnaire, and this is really important. 84% said they were glad they'd taken part in the study. And most of them had said they'd learned something about themselves. So that's quite clear when we're looking at the ethics. Now, Milgram's conclusion then, you're not going to be asked this, but it was really quite interesting, is that the reason that these men had administered the electric shocks to Mr. Wallace till they thought that he could potentially have died and killed somebody wasn't because of their personality. It's because of the situation they found themselves in, because they were at Yale University, had an experimenter there in a lab coat telling them what to do, that they hadn't initially killed them, that they started just on a very simple 15-volt buzz, but went further. Okay, right, so 2 areas that are big for exam questions are validity and ethics. So let's look at the validity of the study. It was a controlled study. They controlled extraneous variables. So Milgram claimed that if you can control the extraneous variables, then you know you're measuring what you claim to measure. So he claimed he would have internal validity because it was a controlled study. Milgram also claimed that because he'd used a man in a grey lab coat, that's very similar to a military kind of uniform, and that he'd had a gradual increase of 15 volts, so the orders got harsher and harsher as they went on. He said this reflected real life. This reflected what happened in Germany with the Germans and the Jews. So it had ecological validity. So the control gave it internal validity. What he had put in place gave it external or ecological validity. Now, his greatest critics are Orne and Holland, and there's a name that you can drop in, because they said, no, it didn't have external validity. All he was doing was measuring the relationship between a researcher and a participant. That is very different to measuring the relationship between somebody who has authority in the military and somebody who also is in the military, or in any other situation there. And so we can't take what happens at Yale University with a researcher and a participant and use that to explain what happened with other groups of people. So therefore it lacked the ecological validity. It was too artificial, lacked the ecological validity. One of their arguments that they gave is that, you know, these participants were told that this isn't going to harm Mr. Wallace. Well, if you're given a gun with bullets in and told to point it at somebody, you know then that that is going to harm them. So they argued that it didn't reflect real life. They also argued that it lacked internal validity, because the researcher would go in and they would quickly, the participant would go in and they would quickly work out that this wasn't real, for different reasons. Number one, it seemed very severe. The administering electric shocks, the punishment seemed far too severe, that wouldn't be real, that Yale University wouldn't allow someone to get harmed. Also, why were they there? Why wasn't the researcher, the experimenter, carrying out the electric shocks? So they claim that they would work out quite quickly that actually Mr. Wallace wasn't really getting harmed, and that's why they were more willing to carry on. So Holland repeated the study themselves in 1967 and asked them, did you think this was real? And 3/4 of the participants said no, they didn't think it was real. So that supports them in that idea that it lacks internal validity. But Milgram argued back on this and said, well, hang on a minute. These people were showing real signs of distress, biting their lips, but had the seizures. They thought this was real. They thought they were harming Mr. Wallace. You are incorrect. So in a question, if you had one on validity, you could present these arguments. You know, what did Milgram argue as to why it was valid and why, and what were Orner and Holland's arguments? The other aspect of it is 40 males from the New Haven area. Does that have population validity? Does that represent what happened in Germany or Papua New Guinea or what happens in Darlington? So it lacked, there wasn't enough people. They were all male and they were from all a certain area. This lacked population validity. Okay, the other issue would be ethics. So this is a name that you may or may not be familiar with. There's a picture of there, Dina Baumrind. She was an American who was very, very critical of social psychological research, particularly Milgram. She really was outspoken of her criticisms of Milgram. She also had a really cool pair of glasses, if you look at those. So what she said was that actually there was so much distress caused with those participants. There was so much psychological harm that it can't be justified. So psychological harm, that Milgram had not protected his participants from harm. He just allowed that to happen. Okay. Now, Milgram, in his defense, said, well, I didn't know this was going to happen. We thought most of the people would drop out at 300 volts. And also, most of the participants said they were glad that they'd done it. So that was okay. It's almost like prior consent to them having psychological harm there. Yeah, that works. The first argument, Milgram, though, he repeated his study again and again and again, knowing full well what would happen. So I'm not really sure that was a legitimate argument. This study has also been seen as unethical because of the deception, that the participants did not know that it was on, they hadn't given their informed consent to being part of a study on compliance and obedience. They didn't know that the electric shocks were not real. They didn't know that Mr. Wallace, the learner, was an actor. It was just riddled with deception, all the way from them choosing lots who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. It was rigged, so the participant was always the teacher. Okay, so all of that deception made it unethical. Also, prevented them from withdrawing. The verbal prods stopped them from withdrawing, that they didn't have the opportunity to withdraw from the study, which really they should have had that opportunity to. Remember, ethical guidelines did not exist when Milgram was carrying out this research. He wasn't breaking any current, or wasn't any ethical guidelines of that time, though he would have broken them all today. So Milgram said, look, you need to have some deception. There's no way we could look at this kind of behavior without deceiving. It was essential to have to happen. And they did have the right to withdraw because 14 people dropped out. So they withdrew. So it was an option, but it wasn't very easy for them to do that. There's an argument as well that, okay, so for a small amount of people, there was some distress caused. It was very difficult, but for the greater good. So we now understand to a greater extent the impact that obedience can have on the population, and that can guard us from things like the Holocaust occurring again. So in the end, there's Milgram with his electric shock generator. As you can see, all the buttons there, have a little count, see how many you can fit in there. By the way, I mean, it was just a fake machine. But in the end, what have we got? Milgram had a well-controlled study. He was pioneering this stuff. Yes, it wasn't an experiment, but you could say that he'd really thought this through and had controlled the extraneous variables. Does it relate to real life? Well, that's questionable. Was it unethical? Well, it seemed to be unethical, but he did make a pretty good argument as to why it was like that. And we can really say maybe the ends justify the means. Okay, so hopefully you've learned a little bit about Milgram's study. Good luck with the exam questions.